Let's dive into a primal survival story. Number 10. The Toba supervolcano and the genetic bottleneck. Picture this. Roughly 74,000 years ago, on the land we now call the Indonesian island of Sumatra, Earth unleashed one of the most cataclysmic geological events in the past 2 million years. The Toba supervolcano erupted with an unimaginable force, an estimated magnitude 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, the absolute highest classification. This eruption spewed approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, it was 100 times more explosive than the devastating Mount Tambora eruption of 1815, an event significant enough to cause the infamous year without a summer across the northern hemisphere. Toba wasn't just a disaster, it was an extinction-level event that humanity barely miraculously survived. The very existence of our species hung by a thread. The sheer power of that blast was immense. Ash from the eruption has been unearthed in sediment layers across the entire Indian Ocean, reaching as far as East Africa, more than 7,000 kilometers from the volcano's origin. Geologists meticulously studying ash deposits across the Indian Ocean and South Asia have traced the fallout from the Toba eruption across thousands of kilometers. In central India, in some locations, deposits from this single event reach depths of 6 meters, blanketing the subcontinent in volcanic debris. This suffocated plant life, annihilated food chains, and utterly collapsed entire ecosystems. The ripple effect of destruction was planet-wide. The eruption injected colossal quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, triggering a global cooling event that climate scientists chillingly call a volcanic winter. Temperatures plummeted across the planet by an estimated 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, though some regions endured far more severe drops. This deep freeze endured for years, possibly even decades. Forests died en masse. Rivers froze solid in latitudes that had never seen ice before. The very sky itself turned the color of bruised iron, and the sun, a dim red disk, offered no warmth at all. Imagine a world plunged into a suffocating frozen twilight. But here's where the horror truly becomes personal. In 1998, geneticist Stanley Ambrose from the University of Illinois proposed that the Toba eruption directly corresponds with a mysterious genetic bottleneck in human DNA. Studies of mitochondrial DNA strongly suggest that around 70,000 years ago, the entire human population may have collapsed to an incredibly small number, as few as 3,000 to 10,000 reproducing individuals. Every single human alive today, all 8 billion of us, descends from this catastrophically tiny, surviving group. We are not the descendants of a thriving, global species. No, we are the descendants of refugees who witnessed their world come to a terrifying, abrupt end. Every gene in your body, every trait you inherited, every distinct feature of your face traces back to those few thousand survivors who somehow endured a catastrophe that, by all rights, should have wiped our species from the face of the planet. Take a moment to truly internalize that. The implications are genuinely staggering. Before Toba, anatomically modern humans had spread across Africa and ventured into parts of the Middle East. They had developed complex tools, language, sophisticated social structures, and the remarkable cognitive capacity that defines our species. Then, in an instant, a single volcano in Indonesia nearly erased it all. The subsequent cooling and the widespread drought transformed once habitable savannas into barren wastelands. Essential food sources vanished. Water became desperately scarce. Human populations crashed across continents. For thousands of years afterward, our ancestors clung to a precarious existence in scattered refugia, isolated pockets of survivable territory where they hunted, foraged, and patiently waited for a world that wasn't actively trying to kill them. Some groups never recovered. Their bloodlines simply ended, their last members dying alone in caves and shelters that archaeologists would not discover for tens of thousands of years. Their stories are lost to us forever. What makes this event particularly disturbing is just how close we came to never existing at all. A breeding population of only a few thousand individuals is perilously small. Genetic diversity collapses, harmful mutations accumulate, and a single additional disaster could easily finish what the first one started. Conservation biologists today consider any species with a population of less than 5,000 to be critically endangered. We fell far below that threshold. Every disease, every climate fluctuation, every predation encounter during those millennia could have brought the human story to a permanent, absolute end. Our very existence was a constant gamble against total annihilation. The fact that you exist to hear these words is itself a testament to a survival story so improbable, so against all odds, that it verges on the miraculous. Something deep in our ancestors, a primal will, simply refused to die out. And you, reading this, are the living proof of that stubborn refusal. The Toba super-eruption didn't just sculpt human history, it very nearly erased it entirely. And the profound, deafening silence of the millions of bloodlines that failed to survive that cataclysm resonates as the loudest absence in our collective genetic record. This forgotten past is literally inscribed in our DNA. Now, let's explore number 9, the megafauna apocalypse and the Great Silence. For the vast majority of human history, our ancestors shared this planet with creatures of such immense scale, such bewildering strangeness, and such sheer terror that the wildlife of today feels impoverished by comparison. During the Pleistocene epoch, a colossal age that commenced approximately 2.6 million years ago and concluded a mere 11,700 years ago, the continents were utterly dominated by megafauna. Imagine elephant-sized giant ground sloths lumbering across the Americas, their slow, deliberate footsteps shaking the very earth beneath them. Picture mammoths and mastodons, vast herds of them, trampling across the icy expanses of Eurasia and North America, their breath misting in the frigid air. Consider cave bears standing and imposing 3 meters tall, casting long, menacing shadows over prehistoric landscapes. Dire wolves, fierce and formidable, hunted in coordinated packs across the entirety of the Western Hemisphere, their howls echoing across ancient plains. And most terrifying of all, saber-toothed cats with canine teeth as long and sharp as a human forearm stalked their prey across boundless grasslands that have since vanished from existence. The world then was a symphony of roars, trumpets, and deep thrumming sounds, a cacophony of giants. The very ground trembled under the collective weight of creatures that have absolutely no living equivalents on Earth today. It was a savage, magnificent world. Then, with a terrifying, almost instantaneous speed, nearly all of them vanished. The extinction event that brought an end to the Pleistocene megafauna remains one of the most fiercely debated and haunting mysteries in the field of paleontology. Between roughly 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, varying by continent, an estimated 65% of all large mammal species on Earth simply ceased to exist. In North America alone, 35 distinct genera of massive mammals disappeared in what amounts to a geological blink of an eye. South America suffered an even greater loss, watching 50 genera vanish forever. Australia was decimated, losing a staggering 88% of its unique megafauna. Only Africa, where these magnificent animals had co-evolved with hominins for millions of years, managed to retain the majority of its giants. Everywhere else, from freezing tundras to scorching deserts, the great beasts were systematically erased from existence. The fossil record starkly illustrates this. Their bones pile up in specific geological layers, and then, abruptly, there is nothing. The vibrant world that had persisted for millions of years simply stopped. It was as if a colossal curtain had fallen across an entire era of life on Earth, plunging it into an unnatural silence. What makes this particular extinction event so profoundly unsettling, so deeply disturbing, is the identity of the prime suspect. The chilling pattern of these widespread die-offs correlates with almost surgical precision to the arrival of modern humans. When our ancestors first set foot on Australia approximately 65,000 years ago, the continent's distinct megafauna collapsed within a mere few thousand years. And when humans finally crossed into the Americas around 15,000 years ago, the identical, devastating pattern repeated itself. Mammoths, mastodons, colossal giant beavers, formidable short-faced bears, all of them were gone, often within a geological blink of our species' arrival. Certainly, climate change played a role. Shifting habitats undoubtedly contributed to the immense pressure on these species. But the correlation between human migration and megafaunal extinction is so consistently precise, so unnervingly repeatable across every continent, that paleontologists are increasingly forced to point toward a far darker, more disturbing conclusion. We hunted them to extinction. The pattern observed in the fossil record is simply too clean, too precise, and too horrifyingly repeatable to be dismissed as mere coincidence. The implications of this truth completely reshape our understanding of what it means to be human. We did not merely enter a stable, established natural world and simply find our modest place within it. No, we arrived as the most incredibly efficient, adaptable predators ever to evolve, and we systematically dismantled ancient ecosystems that had flourished for millions upon millions of years. Our ancestors, far from being the gentle stewards of the land romanticized in myth, were in fact apex predators of unmatched skill. Coordinated hunting parties, utilizing the devastating power of fire, ingenious traps, and highly effective projectile weapons, could bring down animals weighing many tons. They hunted creatures of such vast scale that their very disappearance fundamentally reshaped entire landscapes. The vast, sweeping grasslands of North America exist in their current form precisely because we eliminated the massive herbivores that maintained them. The dense, sprawling forests of South America grew and evolved differently because we erased the giant herbivores that had pruned and shaped them for millennia. We did not passively adapt to the world as it was. Instead, we actively rebuilt it, forging a new reality through the most profound means: extinction. This is the uncomfortable truth of our ecological footprint. The truly horrifying aspect, the part that should chill us to the bone, is the immeasurable loss intrinsic to that process. Imagine for a moment standing in a forest 20,000 years ago and witnessing a colossal giant ground sloth, 6 meters tall, peacefully stripping leaves from a towering tree. Imagine the earth-shaking thunder of mighty mammoth herds migrating across an ancient tundra that stretched unbroken from prehistoric Spain all the way to frozen Siberia. Imagine the profound silence that descended upon entire continents as these magnificent creatures vanished one after another, their presence erased. The ground, once thundering under the weight of millions of years of colossal footsteps, fell still. We, modern humans, have never truly known a wild world. The Earth we inherited is merely a pale, depleted echo of what flourished before us. It's a quiet planet where the greatest beasts have already been extinguished. Yet the predator that emptied those ancient forests remains here, now. It's sitting right there, reading this very script. It's you. Every single human alive today carries the indelible genetic legacy of the most successful exterminator our planet has ever spawned. And the chilling silence of that extinct megafauna is the devastating price our ancestors paid to ensure our survival. This ecological trauma is part of our shared inheritance. Now, let's turn to something else, something equally monumental: the Ice Age that very nearly annihilated everything. Roughly 115,000 years ago, Earth plunged into its most recent ice age, a period geologists ominously refer to as the last glacial period. For the next 100,000 years, our planet was relentlessly trapped in an epic cycle of advancing and retreating ice sheets. This colossal force fundamentally reshaped every single continent and came terrifyingly close to wiping out every single human population struggling to survive in the northern latitudes. At its devastating peak, around 26,500 years ago, these vast ice sheets smothered approximately 1/4 of Earth's entire land surface. Imagine glaciers 2 miles thick, relentlessly grinding entire mountain ranges into mere gravel. Sea levels plummeted by an astonishing 120 meters as an unfathomable amount of water became locked away in these colossal ice formations. Continental shelves dramatically emerged from the oceans, forging land bridges and exposing vast terrains that had been submerged for millions of years. A world map of the last ice age would be utterly unrecognizable to us today, with continents joined by ancient walking routes and oceans drawn back from coastlines that simply no longer exist. It was a world alien to anything we now know. The sheer conditions confronting prehistoric humans during this prolonged era are almost beyond our comprehension. In Europe, the relentless ice front stretched as far south as modern-day Germany and Poland. Beyond these gargantuan glaciers lay an immense belt of permafrost tundra, a desolate, frozen wasteland where temperatures routinely plunge below a brutal -40 degrees Celsius for months on end. The wind screaming across these bleak landscapes carried needle-sharp ice crystals at velocities that could literally flay exposed skin. Trees vanished from the vast majority of the northern hemisphere. The world our ancestors had known, a world of lush forests and comforting seasonal warmth, was violently replaced by an alien planet of ice deserts and stark, unforgiving stone. Fresh water, a fundamental necessity for life, existed only as ice that had to be painstakingly melted using precious fuel. Game animals were critically scarce and constantly migratory, forcing humans to relentlessly follow them across staggering distances that consumed entire seasons to traverse. Survival was a daily, brutal calculus. But here, right here, is where the story ignites into a testament to something almost unbelievable about our tenacious species. Humans, against all odds, did not retreat. They adapted. Archaeological evidence from sites scattered across Europe and Siberia reveals an astounding truth. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals not only survived these brutal conditions, but fundamentally thrived in them. They developed exquisitely tailored clothing using delicate bone needles, the earliest examples of which date back approximately 50,000 years. They constructed intricate shelters from mammoth bones, structures so vast and elaborate they demanded the coordinated effort of dozens of individuals to build. They innovated fat lamps to provide precious light during the months-long, terrifying polar nights. They created breathtaking art on cave walls deep underground, leaving haunting handprints and vibrant animal paintings in chambers where temperatures mercifully remained survivable year-round. They mastered the complex skill of rendering fat from bones and perfected methods for preserving meat through freezing. And they accomplished all of this, every single remarkable feat, without metal tools, without a written language, and without any guidance from previous generations who had ever confronted such apocalyptic conditions. It's a monument to human ingenuity and unbreakable will. Yet, what makes the last glacial period particularly disturbing is the chilling truth it unveils about the sheer precarity of human existence during this epoch. Recent genetic studies horrifyingly suggest that the human population in Europe may have collapsed to a mere few thousand individuals during the most frigid periods, clinging to life in isolated refugia located in southern France, Iberia, and the Italian peninsula. Entire populations were ruthlessly wiped out as the ice inexorably advanced. Flourishing communities that had existed for thousands of years vanished without a trace, without descendants. Their languages, their vibrant cultures, and their very bloodlines were utterly erased from history. We have absolutely no record of who they ever were. We only know about their demise because the genetic record shows a stark absence of living descendants. Their tools, poignant relics of a forgotten era, have been unearthed in caves now long reclaimed and gripped by ice. Their skeletal remains, silent witnesses to their final struggles, have been discovered in shelters where they froze to death, waiting desperately for a spring that, in their lifetimes, never arrived. Imagine the sheer, unyielding desperation. The truly terrifying aspect of this prehistoric ordeal was its sheer, unrelenting duration. This wasn't a sudden cataclysmic event that struck once and then ended. The last glacial period stretched on for a span 20 times longer than the entire recorded history of humanity. For nearly 100,000 years, our ancestors endured conditions that, by all accounts, should have made survival impossible. They watched, generation after generation, as their children grew up in a world permanently encased in ice, knowing no other reality. They buried their dead beneath the frozen earth. They huddled around meager fires, fueled by the precious bone and fat of hunted animals, sharing stories in the encroaching darkness. They brought forth children who would never experience the lushness of a temperate forest. Yet, they persisted, century after brutal century, until finally, around 11,700 years ago, the climate mercifully began to warm. The descendants of these extraordinary survivors emerged into a transformed world, carrying within them a genetic memory of suffering on a scale that we, in our modern comfort, can no longer truly grasp. Every modern human north of the equator can trace their lineage back to these people who endured something that should have utterly annihilated them. The very warmth of your heated room, a luxury you now take for granted, stands as a testament to 100,000 years of frozen struggle and death that paved the way for its existence. It is a comfort bought with unimaginable hardship. Number 7. The Younger Dryas and the Lost Civilization Question. Roughly 12,900 years ago, just as the Earth was finally making its tentative recovery from the last ice age, and human populations were beginning to enjoy the benefits of a gradually warming, more stable climate, something catastrophic and abrupt occurred. The temperature across the northern hemisphere plunged dramatically, returning to brutal glacial conditions almost overnight. Within a few short decades, astonishingly perhaps within a single human lifetime, the climate that had been steadily improving for thousands of years suddenly and violently collapsed. Ice cores extracted from Greenland reveal a chilling narrative. Average temperatures in some regions plummeted by as much as 10 degrees Celsius. The world to which our ancestors had painstakingly adapted itself suddenly turned hostile and unforgiving once more. This 1,200-year cold snap is known as the Younger Dryas, and it remains one of the most profound and mysterious climate events in Earth's recent geological past. For decades, the precise cause of the Younger Dryas has been a subject of intense scientific debate. The prevailing mainstream theory posits that a monumental ice dam in North America fractured, unleashing a colossal deluge of frigid freshwater into the North Atlantic Ocean. This sudden influx then catastrophically disrupted the delicate balance of ocean currents, triggering an incredibly rapid cooling across the northern hemisphere, an event of immense power but contained to Earth. However, in 2007, a team of scientists led by Richard Firestone put forth an explanation far more dramatic and apocalyptic. They proposed that the Younger Dryas was not merely a terrestrial event, but was instead triggered by a cosmic impact, specifically a comet or asteroid that either struck directly or exploded high above the North American ice sheet. This cataclysmic event, they argued, ignited continental-scale wildfires and ejected an immense quantity of dust and debris into the atmosphere, effectively plunging the entire world back into glacial conditions. Compelling evidence supporting this audacious hypothesis includes a distinct layer of nanodiamonds, telltale melted glass spherules, and unusual concentrations of platinum found at archaeological and geological sites across multiple continents, all precisely dated to the very start of the Younger Dryas event. The geological signature of this boundary layer, when examined, reads very much like the aftermath of a single, immense explosion that reverberated across the entire planet simultaneously. It paints a picture of instant, global devastation. What makes the Younger Dryas particularly unsettling is its timing, specifically concerning the trajectory of human development. Just prior to the onset of this devastating cooling period, archaeological evidence strongly suggests that human cultures across the Near East and parts of Asia were on the precipice of a revolutionary transformation. The Natufian culture in the Levant, for instance, had begun to tentatively experiment with agriculture, establishing permanent settlements, and developing the complex social structures that would eventually lay the groundwork for true civilization. Then, the Younger Dryas struck with brutal force. The nascent Natufian culture suffered a catastrophic collapse. Their hard-won settlements were abruptly abandoned. Their populations dwindled dramatically. Whatever proto-civilizations had been painstakingly emerging were effectively erased from existence. The archaeological record clearly shows a sudden, jarring break, a layer of abandonment that starkly separates what came before from what struggled to re-emerge afterward. And the few people who managed to survive this prolonged catastrophe emerged into a world that had utterly forgotten what their grandparents had so diligently built. A vast cultural memory wiped clean. But here is where the narrative becomes truly disturbing. Some researchers, examining the puzzling archaeological gaps and the tenacious folklore of flood myths woven through cultures across the globe, propose that the Younger Dryas catastrophe extinguished far more than just early settlements. They contend that prehistoric humanity may have reached astonishing levels of cultural and technological sophistication, achievements we've completely overlooked, and that the cosmic impact with its ensuing cataclysm simply scrubbed these accomplishments from the historical record, leaving only fragments of distorted memory. The profound flood myths of Mesopotamia, the enigmatic legends of Atlantis, the ancient stories shared by cultures separated by vast oceans about a cataclysmic inundation that shattered an earlier world. These aren't necessarily fanciful inventions. They might, in fact, be deeply embedded memories. They could be the fragmented recollections of a catastrophe so immense, so total, that generations of survivors spent the next 12,000 years simply attempting to comprehend what truly happened to their ancestors. The implications of this theory are absolutely staggering. If even a fraction of this hypothesis holds true, then the narrative of human history stretches back far longer and is infinitely stranger than anything we've been taught. There might have been entire vibrant chapters of our unfolding development that vanished in a maelstrom of fire and ice, leaving behind nothing but whispers, faint myths passed down through hundreds of subsequent generations. The survivors of the Younger Dryas would have been forced to start over, rebuilding from a desolate canvas with only the faintest, most fractured memories of what had been irrevocably lost. The agricultural revolution that emerged after that devastating cold snap wouldn't truly be the dawn of human civilization at all. It would be a second attempt, and we, the inheritors of that desperate second attempt, might very well be living on the ancient bones of a shattered, forgotten world, treading over ruins so incredibly ancient that we mistakenly perceive them as mere natural geological features. Whatever profound knowledge our early ancestors cultivated before the sky itself seemed to fall is now gone, sealed away beneath layers of sediment and ice, patiently waiting in places we haven't yet dared to look. Every time an archaeologist sinks a trowel into unexplored ground, the tantalizing possibility remains that the very next strike will uncover something that, by our current understanding of human development, simply shouldn't exist. Something that would rewrite recorded history. Now let's turn to number 6. The Black Sea Deluge. Approximately 7,600 years ago, in a region that would eventually nurture the very foundations of multiple ancient civilizations, Earth unleashed an act of geological violence so sudden, so vast, that its echoing memory may have reverberated through human cultures for millennia. The Black Sea, which had existed as a vast freshwater lake during the Ice Age, was tenuously separated from the perpetually rising waters of the Mediterranean by a slender strip of land, precisely where the Bosphorus Strait now lies. As global sea levels relentlessly climbed in the wake of relentless glacial melting, immense pressure built against this fragile natural dam. Then, as geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman of Columbia University famously proposed in 1997, the dam catastrophically broke. What ensued was one of the most utterly devastating flooding events in all of human prehistory. The result was a flood unlike anything ever recorded in human experience. According to the compelling Ryan-Pittman hypothesis, saltwater from the burgeoning Mediterranean burst through the breached Bosphorus with a terrifying force estimated to be 200 times the sheer flow rate of Niagara Falls. The water surged into the Black Sea basin without pause, at a rate that might have raised the lake's level by an astonishing 15 centimeters, or about 6 inches, every single day. For months, perhaps even for years on end, this relentless inundation continued. The vibrant freshwater lake was inexorably transformed into a vast, churning salt sea. Coastlines that had sustained human settlements for thousands upon thousands of years were swallowed whole. An area larger than 100,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of Portugal or South Korea, was utterly submerged beneath the relentlessly rising waters. The thunderous roar of the cascading cataract would have been audibly apocalyptic for hundreds of kilometers, a constant, terrifying sound that unequivocally announced the death of the world to anyone within earshot. What renders the Black Sea deluge particularly disturbing is its immense human cost. The fertile shores of that freshwater lake had been pristine, ideal territory for nascent agricultural communities. Rich black soil, abundant freshwater access, and a mild, forgiving climate. Archaeological evidence unequivocally suggests that thousands of people thrived in settlements clustered along the lake's fertile edge. When the cataclysmic flood arrived, they had no warning whatsoever. The geological record indicates that the rapidly rising waters advanced at speeds that would have made escape utterly impossible, especially with precious crops, valuable livestock, and vulnerable family members in tow. Entire villages were submerged, their inhabitants trapped by the relentless rising tide. Entire cultures, painstakingly developed over generations, honing agriculture, constructing homes, and reverently burying their dead in ancestral graves, were forced to witness their entire world vanish beneath the relentlessly advancing wall of seawater. Their future, their past, their present, all erased in an instant. These drowned settlements remain preserved today, tucked away in the anoxic, oxygen-deprived depths of the Black Sea. Here, intrepid divers and advanced remote submersibles have uncovered the ghostly outlines of ancient structures and the vital artifacts of people who simply never made it to higher ground. They are a silent, submerged testament to a forgotten catastrophe. Yet the truly unsettling aspect of this cataclysm is the widespread diaspora that inevitably followed. Researchers who champion the Black Sea deluge hypothesis propose that the survivors of this earth-shattering catastrophe scattered in every conceivable direction, carrying with them not just their families, but also their deeply ingrained stories and their newfound cultural innovations. Some of these survivors journeyed westward, forging new paths into the nascent continent of Europe. Others ventured south, seeking refuge in the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia. Still others migrated eastward toward the formidable Caucasus Mountains. With them, they carried the precious seeds of agriculture, the revolutionary techniques of pottery, and the very earliest forms of written language. And inseparably intertwined with their journeys, they carried the harrowing, indelible memory of the Great Flood itself, a trauma etched into their collective consciousness. The profound narrative of a colossal inundation that obliterated an earlier world echoes through the mythologies of nearly every culture that descended from this tumultuous region. The ancient epic of Gilgamesh vividly describes just such a deluge. The Hebrew Bible meticulously records it as the monumental flood of Noah. Greek mythology carefully preserves this memory in the haunting story of Deucalion and his Ark. These powerful narratives, rather than being mere parallel inventions, might instead be fragmented and reshaped echoes of a single, monumental memory. The memory of an actual historical catastrophe that truly befell the very people whose descendants we are. What renders this theory particularly horrifying is the chilling implication that human civilization, in its most foundational form, was effectively born from profound trauma. The agricultural revolution and the subsequent rise of humanity's earliest cities did not emerge in a peaceful, quiet vacuum of serene innovation. Instead, they erupted in the immediate aftermath of an unspeakable disaster that cruelly displaced thousands of people, forcing them to painfully start over in unfamiliar lands. The earliest known cities of Mesopotamia, those cradles of recorded history, began to flourish within mere centuries of the proposed Black Sea flood. Sumer, Uruk, the foundational settlements of our documented past, were established and built, in part, by populations that included the resilient descendants of refugees from a world that had been utterly swallowed by the sea. Could civilization itself, then, be nothing more than an elaborate coping mechanism? The towering walls, the sacred temples, and the intricate writing systems were not conceived or constructed by people who felt inherently secure in their world. They were built by people who knew, through the harrowing stories passed down from their grandparents, that the world could unexpectedly end without any warning whatsoever. They understood that the only true defense against utter forgetting was to painstakingly carve memory into enduring stone. Every single monument we have ever erected, every meticulous record we have ever kept, every solemn ritual we have ever performed to honor and remember the dead may ultimately trace back to one singular, terrifying afternoon when the sea violently broke through the land and brutally erased everything our ancestors had ever known. Number 5. The Neanderthal extinction and the lingering ghost in our genome. Approximately 400,000 years ago, a distinct hominin species materialized in Europe and Western Asia. This species would go on to dominate these vast continents for an astonishing 360,000 years. The Neanderthals were not the brutish, dull-witted cave dwellers depicted in outdated stereotypes, far from it. They were intelligent, highly skilled toolmakers, masters of fire, and even creators of art. They respectfully buried their dead with flowers, tenderly cared for their elderly and disabled community members, and developed sophisticated hunting techniques that allowed them to successfully take down the largest, most formidable prey animals of the Ice Age. Their brains were, on average, slightly larger than our own. Their bodies were undeniably stronger, more perfectly adapted to the bitter cold, and robustly built for the brutal, unforgiving environments they proudly called home. For hundreds of thousands of years, they stood as the most successful hominin species on Earth outside of distant Africa, and they had every conceivable reason to believe that the world, in its entirety, belonged solely to them. Then, we arrived. And within a mere few thousand years, the Neanderthals were gone, vanished without a trace. The eventual extinction of the Neanderthals occurred between approximately 40,000 and 28,000 years ago, a timeline that precisely coincides with the relentless spread of anatomically modern humans into their ancestral territories. The last known Neanderthal populations desperately clung to existence in the southernmost refugia of Iberia, seeking solace in caves overlooking the azure Mediterranean Sea before their final, inevitable disappearance. The unforgiving fossil record vividly illustrates their numbers dwindling, their settlements contracting, their territories collapsing inward, all while our ancestors rapidly expanded across the breadth of Europe. They did not simply fade away gradually due to climate change alone. Something far more profound and alarming was at play. They simply vanished while sharing a continent with a competing species. A species that hunted the very same prey, occupied the exact same caves, and carried tools and techniques that were perhaps only marginally more efficient than their own. The cold math of competition between two intelligent species vying for the identical ecological niche leaves but one inevitable outcome, and the Neanderthals found themselves tragically on the losing side. What makes the extinction of the Neanderthals particularly chilling is the stark truth it uncovers about our own ancestors. We didn't arrive in Europe as benign settlers, innocently seeking a peaceful coexistence. No, we stormed in as an invasive species, and we systematically replaced the indigenous people we encountered. While genetic evidence clearly shows interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals, indeed most non-African humans alive today carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their very genomes, this genetic inheritance is not, by any stretch, a harmonious testament to peaceful integration. Instead, it's the residual imprint of a protracted period of contact during which two distinct species competed fiercely, occasionally interbred, and ultimately one of them simply ceased to exist as a separate, thriving population. The Neanderthals were not assimilated into the burgeoning stream of modern humanity. They were absorbed, then utterly erased, leaving behind only scattered fragments of themselves woven into the DNA of the species that supplanted them. The truly horrifying aspect that followed was the profound silence. For a staggering 360,000 years, Neanderthals had cultivated their own rich languages, their own profound myths, and their own unique ways of comprehending the world around them. They meticulously buried their dead in deliberate positions, often accompanied by grave goods, strongly suggesting complex beliefs about an afterlife. They adorned caves at significant sites like Maltravieso and La Pasiega, leaving behind haunting handprints and abstract symbols that astonishingly predate the cave art of modern humans by tens of thousands of years. All of that incredibly vast knowledge, all of that intricate culture, all of those countless untold stories perished with them. We remain ignorant of what they called themselves. We don't know which gods they reverently prayed to. We can only speculate about what they thought of the strange, hungry-eyed newcomers from the south, armed with their sharp weapons, who so abruptly arrived on their ancestral lands. The very last Neanderthal ever to draw breath likely died alone in some forgotten cave, the final witness to a magnificent civilization that had endured for hundreds of millennia. And tragically, there was no one left of their own kind to mourn their passing. What renders this final, agonizing detail so unsettling is its sheer proximity to our own time. The last Neanderthals breathed their final breath only about 28,000 years ago. That is a time frame recent enough that their footprints may still be preserved in ancient cave floors, that their tools might still lie undisturbed in the soil, and that the soot from their fires could still stain the ceilings of the very rock shelters where they sought refuge. They were here. They were truly people. In a crucial sense, they were us, sharing a stunning 99.7% of our DNA. And we replaced them. The haunting ghost in our genome is the potent genetic memory of a species that lost a war they may not have even known they were fighting. And today, every single modern human of European or Asian descent carries a tiny, indelible fragment of those vanished people within them, a profound biological echo of the world we irrevocably inherited by obliterating the people who possessed it first. Moving on to number 4, the African megadrought. Between approximately 135,000 and 75,000 years ago, the vast African continent endured a devastating series of climate catastrophes, events that very nearly extinguished the nascent species that would eventually evolve into humanity itself. Lake sediment cores, meticulously extracted from East Africa, particularly from the deep waters of Lake Malawi, reveal undeniable evidence of prolonged droughts so extraordinarily severe that the Great Lakes of the Rift Valley dramatically shrank to a mere fraction of their customary size. Lake Malawi, which stands today as one of the largest lakes on Earth, may have lost more than 95% of its precious water during the absolute worst of these brutally dry periods. The expansive savannas that had sustained early human populations for hundreds of thousands of years transformed almost overnight into parched deserts. The animals that humans relied upon for survival either vanished entirely or migrated desperately away. The vital water sources that humans depended on became poisoned, turning into brackish, salty puddles surrounded by the skeletal remains of those who had tragically attempted to drink from them. While the precise cause of this gargantuan African megadrought remains a subject of intense debate, its devastating consequences are indelibly etched into both the geological and genetic records, with a brutal, undeniable clarity. Climate scientists now believe the Earth's orbital shifts, combined with dramatic changes in atmospheric circulation, triggered massive disruptions in Africa's monsoon systems. Rainfall patterns, which had sustained human life for tens of thousands of years, simply collapsed. Entire regions that had been perfectly habitable became utterly unlivable within just a few generations. The early human populations, once spreading across the continent, were forced into a desperate retreat, shrinking into a handful of refugia, small ecological islands where water and food miraculously remained accessible. These were critical havens, often surrounded by vast, dead stretches of land that no human could cross. What makes the African megadrought particularly disturbing is what it forced our ancestors to do. Genetic evidence suggests that during the worst of these dry periods, the human population in Africa may have collapsed to just a few hundred breeding individuals concentrated in a handful of survivable locations. One of these refugia may have been along the southern coast of what is now South Africa, in a region called Pinnacle Point. Archaeological excavations at sites in this region have revealed something extraordinary. The humans who survived there did so by completely transforming their relationship with the environment. They began harvesting shellfish from the tidal zones. They developed advanced stone tool techniques. They used pigments, possibly for body decoration or symbolic purposes. They were the first humans to exploit marine resources on a sustained basis. And the innovative techniques they developed while battling the megadrought may have been the very foundation of all later human cultural evolution. Necessity truly was the mother of invention. The truly horrifying aspect is the bottleneck this created. For tens of thousands of years, humanity may have been confined to a thin strip of coastline, thousands of kilometers from the lush savannas where our species had first emerged. The interior of Africa was largely empty of humans. The vast majority of our potential territory was uninhabitable. If those few hundred survivors at Pinnacle Point and similar refugia had failed, if a single bad storm or disease outbreak had wiped them out, the entire human story would have ended before it had truly begun. There would be no ancient Egypt, no Roman Empire, no Renaissance, no Industrial Revolution, no civilization at all. The future of our species was concentrated in the hands of a few hundred people clinging to a coastline at the edge of a dying continent. And they had no idea that the survival of every human being who would ever live depended solely on them. What makes this particularly unsettling is the implication for who we are today. The cognitive and behavioral traits that define modern humanity, the symbolic thinking, the artistic expression, the complex social structures, may not be the result of gradual, peaceful evolution in a stable environment. They may be the direct result of intense selection pressure during the megadrought. The humans who survived were the ones who could think abstractly enough to recognize new food sources, communicate complex ideas about marine harvesting, and cooperate in groups large enough to defend their precious refugia. We are not the descendants of average humans. We are the descendants of the most adaptable, most creative, and most desperate survivors of a near-extinction event. The traits that allow you to read this script, to understand abstract concepts, to imagine the past and the future, were forged in the fire of a catastrophe that almost ended us. And the rest of humanity, the ones who could not adapt, died on the dry plains where their bones remain unburied, forgotten by history. Number 3. The Great Cannibal Winter. Between approximately 45,000 and 30,000 years ago, during the final brutal phase of the last ice age, shocking evidence began appearing in the archaeological record that points to one of the darkest chapters in human prehistory. Excavations at sites across Europe, including Gough's Cave in England, Dirk Krapina in Croatia, and Goyet Cave in Belgium, have unearthed a grim discovery: human bones bearing the unmistakable marks of butchery. Cut marks consistent with the systematic removal of flesh. Crack patterns indicating that long bones were purposefully broken open to access the nutrient-rich marrow. Beyond the butchered bones, macabre trophies emerged, skulls painstakingly modified into drinking vessels. This wasn't an isolated incident, a mere anomaly. Across vast stretches of prehistoric Europe, the evidence for unthinkable acts became widespread, undeniably consistent, and deeply disturbing. During the most brutal stretches of the Ice Age, our ancient ancestors did the unimaginable. They ate each other. The interpretation of such ancient cannibalism is, understandably, a fraught and complicated debate. Some archaeologists propose a ritualistic dimension, suggesting it was a way to honor the deceased, to symbolically incorporate their essence into the living tribe. Others argue for a more desperate, brutal reality, a survival mechanism born from the crushing grip of starvation, when all other food sources vanished without a trace, leaving no other option. The truth likely weaves these explanations together, shifting with the specific time, place, and people involved. Yet the sheer volume of archaeological finds paints a stark picture. Prehistoric cannibalism wasn't a rare, fleeting aberration. It was a pervasive, recurring practice, spanning multiple continents, across multiple epochs, and even among various hominin species, including both our direct modern human ancestors and our close relatives, the Neanderthals. The very bones of our forebears lie scattered across ancient cave floors, bearing the exact same telltale butchery marks we find on the remains of the animals they hunted for survival. What elevates this ancient practice from merely disturbing to truly horrifying is what it unflinchingly reveals about the sheer desperation of the conditions our ancestors wrestled with. The Ice Age wasn't a monotonous, unbroken period of mere hardship. It was punctuated by cataclysmic resource collapses. During these apocalyptic phases, entire human populations were forced to confront an unthinkable choice: succumb to starvation or consume their own. When the migratory herds failed to appear, when the relentless cold froze vegetation to death, when snow buried the world for months on end, the only available protein, the only chance for survival, was found in the bodies of those who had already perished. Even our own DNA carries the lingering silent echoes of this widespread cannibalism. Genetic evidence in specific modern human populations reveals protective mutations against prion diseases, the very brain-wasting illnesses that can arise from consuming infected human tissue. This is biological proof, etched into our very being. Our ancestors consumed human brains often enough that natural selection itself had to adapt us to survive the grotesque consequences. A chilling testament to extreme pressures. But the truly horrific aspect transcends the biological. It lies in the profound social cost. Cannibalism wasn't simply about consuming bodies that had died of natural causes. Evidence from some sites chillingly suggests that humans were actively killed specifically for food. The butchery patterns are too systematic, the bone collections too meticulously organized, the demographic patterns of the remains too suspiciously skewed. At certain sites, the delicate bones of children appear alongside those of adults, all bearing the same processing techniques used for butchering game animals. During these darkest periods, entire communities may have fractured, turning violently upon themselves. The strong devoured the weak, the living consumed the dying, and the survivors, forever burdened, carried the indelible memory of what they had done simply to endure another winter. What makes this chapter particularly unsettling is the profound silence that has followed. For we are the direct descendants of these prehistoric cannibals. Every single modern human carries within their genetic code the legacy of ancestors who, at some point in the deep past, made the ultimate agonizing choice to consume their own kind in order to survive. Whatever elaborate stories they concocted to justify their actions, whatever rituals they developed to process the unbearable trauma, whatever names they refused to utter aloud afterward, all of it is irrevocably lost to time. The cold cave floors hold the undeniable evidence, but its deeper meaning, its emotional weight, has vanished. We know with chilling certainty that our ancestors did this. We cannot, however, fathom how they lived with themselves afterward, or how they explained it to the children who grew up in those very caves, surrounded by the scattered bones of their own relatives. The ancient walls of those caves still bear silent witness to a primordial darkness that civilization has spent the last 30,000 years desperately trying to bury. And the genetic memory of that darkness, silent and dormant, is carried within the very cells of every human being alive today. Next, we turn to the second great demographic mystery, the disease that nearly erased the New World. For tens of thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of the Americas lived in profound isolation from the bustling populations of Eurasia and Africa. This isolation, which began approximately 11,000 years ago when rising sea levels submerged the ancient Bering Land Bridge, had enormously profound and ultimately tragic consequences for the development of immune systems on both sides of the vast Pacific. Meanwhile, the inhabitants of the Old World, Europe, Asia, and Africa, lived in dense agricultural societies. These communities were cradled by domesticated animals, fostering centuries of exposure to diseases that readily jumped from livestock to humans. Smallpox, measles, influenza, mumps, typhus, cholera, and countless other pathogens weren't random occurrences. They evolved in the brutal crucible of Eurasian and African civilization. They culled populations indiscriminately, killing those who lacked any innate resistance while leaving the survivors armed with protective antibodies, an immunity passed down to their descendants. But across the vast ocean, the peoples of the Americas, utterly separated from these old-world disease reservoirs, never developed such immunities. They lived in an immunological bubble, protected yet dangerously vulnerable in the long term. When these two worlds finally and violently collided, the result was nothing short of the greatest demographic catastrophe in all of human history. Yet, this is where the narrative descends into true horror, because the very seeds of this future catastrophe were sown deep in the primordial past. The indigenous populations of the Americas weren't vulnerable because they were somehow primitive or unhealthy. Their bodies were simply unprepared. Their extreme vulnerability was a tragic consequence of choices their ancient ancestors made, tens of thousands of years earlier. The early humans who first crossed the Bering Land Bridge carried with them only a tiny handful of domesticated animals, primarily the dog. Crucially, few of the species that would later become virulent disease vectors in the Old World even existed in the Americas. There were no cattle to transmit tuberculosis, no pigs to incubate deadly influenza variants, no chickens to harbor avian diseases that could jump to humans. In essence, the Americas were biologically pristine compared to Eurasia. And that very cleanliness, meticulously preserved over thousands of years of prehistoric isolation, became an unimaginable death sentence the moment contact finally occurred. What makes this reality particularly chilling is the sheer, devastating scale of the events that unfolded. When European diseases first arrived in the Americas during the 16th century, the resulting death toll was almost incomprehensible. Estimates for the indigenous population of the Americas before this contact range wildly, from 50 million to well over 100 million souls. Within just 150 years of that initial contact, that vast population had plummeted by as much as 90%. Entire civilizations, some of which had flowered for thousands of years, were simply eradicated. This wasn't merely the brutal consequence of warfare or conquest alone, but the unseen, insidious work of microscopic organisms that the survivors could not perceive, could not understand, and thus could not possibly fight. Smallpox alone wiped out millions. Measles claimed millions more. The populations of entire continents were tragically reduced to scattered fragments within just a few short generations. The genetic and cultural diversity of half the world was forever extinguished, a holocaust delivered by unseen enemies. The truly unsettling dimension here isn't just the event, but its prehistoric origin. The decisions made by the first Americans countless millennia ago, the animals they chose or chose not to domesticate, the diseases they encountered, or crucially, did not encounter, and the unbroken isolation they maintained for thousands of years, all these factors inexorably determined the outcome of a catastrophe that wouldn't strike until long after their own deaths. Their descendants didn't just inherit lands and languages, they inherited an immunological innocence, and that innocence ultimately killed them. The prehistoric isolation of the Americas wasn't some neutral geographic fact. It was a slow-motion trap that had been setting itself for 11,000 years. The people who walked into it had absolutely no way of knowing that the conditions that had ensured their survival in the deep past would also become the very conditions for their utter destruction in the future. This story becomes profoundly horrifying because of the stark lesson it delivers about the incredibly long reach of prehistoric events. The seemingly distant choices our ancestors made, the environments they inhabited, the biological encounters they had or desperately missed, all continue to shape the fate of their descendants thousands of years later. Every modern human population on Earth today carries the indelible legacy of prehistoric decisions, ancient exposures, and forgotten isolations. These are the spectral forces that determined which diseases they could withstand and which would utterly devastate them. The ghosts of the prehistoric past are not confined to dusty museum exhibits or academic excavation sites. They reside within our very immune systems, in our inherited genetic vulnerabilities, and in the diseases that tragically still claim the lives of some populations far more readily than others. The catastrophe that obliterated the indigenous peoples of the Americas was not truly set in motion in the year 1492. Its origins stretch back much further, to that silent, prehistoric crossing of the Bering Land Bridge, and the lingering echoes of that ancient migration still carve deep demographic shadows across our modern world. This brings us to a pivotal moment. Number 1, the cognitive revolution and the death of innocence itself. Roughly 70,000 years ago, something truly profound happened to the human brain. Archaeological evidence unearthed from sites spanning Africa and the Middle East reveals a sudden, explosive surge in human cultural complexity. Before this period, the tools and artifacts left behind by anatomically modern humans were, frankly, almost indistinguishable from those crafted by other hominin species. Stone tools were purely functional, rudimentary, and evolved at a snail's pace. There was no art. Critically, there was no symbolic decoration. There was absolutely no evidence of religious belief or any form of abstract thinking. Humans were merely surviving, existing. Then, within what geologists consider a remarkably brief window, everything shifted. Humans began to meticulously create jewelry from delicate shell beads. They painted vivid murals on cave walls. They carved intricate figurines from ivory and bone. They started burying their dead with grave goods, a practice imbued with symbolic meaning. They engineered complex tools, embarked on long-distance trade, exchanging materials across hundreds of kilometers, and began to think in ways no other species on Earth had ever conceived. The historian Yuval Noah Harari famously dubbed this the cognitive revolution, and it stands as the singular event that forged us into human in every meaningful sense of the word. The precise cause of this cognitive revolution remains one of the most tantalizing mysteries in the grand tapestry of human evolution. Some researchers propose a genetic mutation, perhaps involving the FOXP2 gene linked to language, suddenly unleashed new forms of communication and the capacity for abstract thought. Others suggest this monumental cognitive leap was the cumulative result of cultural innovations, each generation building upon the last until a critical threshold was triumphantly crossed. Still others argue that intense environmental pressures during the vast African megadrought era favored individuals capable of complex abstract reasoning, ensuring that the survivors of that evolutionary bottleneck passed on their significant cognitive advantages to all subsequent generations. Whatever its origin, the consequences of this revolution profoundly reshaped the entire planet. Within a mere few tens of thousands of years, a single hominin species, us, had expanded from Africa, colonizing every habitable continent. We replaced or absorbed every other hominin population on Earth, and we developed the sophisticated cognitive infrastructure that would eventually give rise to agriculture, complex civilization, and advanced technology. We became masters of our environment and, unknowingly, our own minds. But here is where this story takes a truly unsettling turn. The cognitive revolution didn't just bestow upon us art, language, and abstract thought. It also gifted us the terrifying ability to imagine our own deaths. Before this revolution, no animal on Earth, as far as we can discern, possessed a clear, conscious understanding of personal mortality. Animals instinctively avoid pain and relentlessly seek survival, but they don't appear to spend their lives endlessly contemplating the chilling inevitability of their own end. They live in the eternal present. Humans are fundamentally different. The very cognitive capacities that enable us to meticulously plan for the future, to conjure alternative scenarios, and to think symbolically also force us to know with dreadful, inescapable certainty that we will one day die. Every single burial site from the Upper Paleolithic period onward bears silent, poignant witness to this knowledge. The carefully placed grave goods, the scattering of ochre pigments over the bodies, the deliberate positioning of the dead, sometimes in fetal poses, sometimes facing east towards the rising sun, all of it represents the very first tentative attempts of conscious beings to grapple with the profound horror of their own mortality. Death became an abstraction, a future reality. The truly nightmarish aspect of the cognitive revolution lies in what it ultimately cost us. We gained the astonishing ability to create civilizations, but in exchange, we forever lost the blissful innocence of unawareness. Our prehistoric ancestors became the very first creatures on Earth who knew, from a young age, that they would inevitably lose everyone they deeply loved. They became the first creatures who understood that all of their tireless efforts would eventually be erased by time. They became the first creatures who gazes up at the boundless stars and felt intensely, profoundly, small, yet utterly alone, knowing their own end, the burden of self-awareness. The earliest religions, the foundational myths, the initial stories about gods, and the promise of afterlives, all of these emerged directly from this agonizingly new and terrible awareness. Every towering cathedral that pierces the sky, every hushed prayer ever whispered, every profound philosophical treatise ever penned, all of it traces its lineage back to a singular, pivotal moment. 70,000 years ago, when humanity first awakened to the chilling reality of its own mortality. At that instant, our ancestors collectively understood they simply couldn't endure such terrifying knowledge in isolation. They needed meaning, community, and the hope of something beyond the inevitable. What makes this realization particularly unsettling and profoundly inescapable is the legacy it carved into our very being. Every single modern human carries within them the same cognitive framework, the very equipment that emerged from this ancient prehistoric revolution. The identical brain structures that allow you to effortlessly read these words, to grasp their intricate meaning, and to vividly imagine the events they meticulously describe, are also precisely what compel you to confront the undeniable truth that you too will eventually die. There is no escaping the weight of this awareness, no gentle return to the blissful unconsciousness that preceded our cognitive awakening. We are fundamentally trapped within the intricate minds that paradoxically gifted us our humanity. The steep price of our remarkable intelligence is this persistent, nagging background awareness that everything we cherish and love is inherently temporary, fleeting. Our prehistoric forebears were the first to pay this agonizing cost, and they meticulously passed it down to us, generation by generation, through the vast expanse of time. Therefore, the primal horror lying at the very core of the human experience isn't found in the cataclysmic events that almost annihilated us as a species. Instead, it resides in the profound, all-encompassing awareness that was forged through merely surviving those catastrophes. It is the gnawing knowledge bestowed upon us by ancestors we will never truly know, an awareness that we, in turn, are fated to pass on to future generations, to children who will then spend their entire lives grappling to make some semblance of peace with the identical darkness that has relentlessly haunted our species from the exact moment we became truly, uniquely ourselves.